I'm Jess Lenore with the Real News Network. We have a very special guest today in studio. I'm here with DeRay McKesson. He's most famous for his role in Black Lives Matter and his entry into the mayoral run in Baltimore. But what some might not know about him is his experience and knowledge in public education. He's a former Teach for America Corps member. He taught in New York City Public Schools in East New York, I believe. And he is an administrator with Minneapolis Public Schools before joining the Ferguson protests. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So, public education is in crisis in America, and especially for urban education. And that's an historical problem. You can't separate that from history. You can't separate that from race. You can't separate that from community control, which is what suburban school districts have, white school districts have, but urban school districts don't have that. For the last 2 decades, the city of Baltimore has not had control of its public schools. And we've been going through your 26-page plan, and you have a whole range of things you wanted to transform in public education, assert more control through the city. Talk about what your vision is. This is one of the most important yet least talked about issues in society and in Baltimore today.
Yes, like you said, I was a teacher. I was the #2 human capital here for Baltimore City Public Schools and in Minneapolis Public Schools. My work has been devoted to issues of children, youth, and families for so long. And then Mike Brown got killed, and it was even this thing about you have to be alive to learn, right? Which is why I started to do the work around activism.
And he was 18 years old, so he was just a few years. He was basically just had finished the public school system.
He'll never have a college professor. Ayanna Jones will never have a high school teacher. Tamir Rice will never have a high school teacher. That matters to me. When I think about Baltimore and issues of equity, there are four institutions that the mayor's office doesn't manage: buses, the jail, the community college, or schools. And for us to have a strategy around how to make the city better, at some point we'll have to change our relationship with those institutions. With the school system, I'm mindful of the fact that it's a $1 billion organization with 12,000 staff. The city of Baltimore itself is only a $3 billion organization with 14,000 staff. It's a massive operation to subsume. What I'm proposing is to have a comprehensive strategy around literacy in a way that we've never had in the city, especially adult literacy. You think about what does it mean that 40% of the adults in the city can't functionally read.
This is the city that reads. Most people might have forgotten that, but that is the slogan written on all the benches around the city.
Yeah, and what we know is that it's not true. So we think about what does it mean to make sure that people have the skills to enter the next generation of jobs, or to make sure that people can actually be in professions that have a ladder, a career ladder. Not being able to read is a huge barrier, and we have to figure that out at the adult level and also at the child level. And then what does it mean to think about wraparound? So when we do home visits, the 0 to 3 Head Start, making sure that kids are in Head Start.
And so for people that don't know about this was an idea that I know you're familiar with Harlem Children's Zone,
Yeah.
But it's the idea that you're not just a student when you enter the classroom. You're going to come to your home and you're going to provide all the services. And I mean, basically, it's like society. You're saying, kind of acknowledging the fact that society is crumbling around these students. So let's step up and kind of provide these roles to basically to even the playing field, right?
And we can start supports for kids at conception. And that's what the Harlem Children's Zone pioneered with Baby College. I used to help lead the largest community center in the Harlem Children's Zone. We have 500 kids a day, 1,400 families a cycle. And the model works, and we can do it here at 0 to 3 with Head Start, 4 or 5 pre-K. People talk about expanding pre-K. Pre-K, 85% of kids who are eligible already go. So it's really like this 1,000 kid gap, right, of kids who aren't getting services, who should be, and we can fix that.
And that's a key issue for working class people, for black people in the city. You go to the suburbs and people have time to spend at home. They have a bigger family structure that's around to help be around their kids, be able to teach them how to read, and just spend time with them. So these are services that working class people are not getting.
And they could,
yeah.
right? That in the city, it's not so much a lack of resources or a lack of money. It is wholly a lack of strategy and a lack of planning. And we can actually do this work in a way that's coordinated. We think about home visits. If we do home visits in a coordinated way, that can get us to testing for lead early. It can help us make sure people apply for the right tax credits. And it can also get us to make sure kids have libraries at home. We can actually do that in a structured way, but it takes a strategy.
And so we talked about the Harlem Children's Zone a little bit, and that is a charter school. And the whole idea of charter schools was to provide space for innovation and creativity. And now that was like some 2 decades ago, but now there's a bigger debate around it. And nationally, in Maryland's and Baltimore is unique in a lot of ways because the charter school system is within the public school system. And so there was a bill proposed last year about what to do with the charter schools in Maryland. The charter school operators have been critical of the system. So what is your vision for how charter schools should function in Maryland? Should they stay within the public school system, which is a radical departure from the national model?
Yeah, I think that at its core, charter schools are this idea that if we lower constraints, it allows for increased innovation that should also lead to increased results. I think that's the concept. I think the way that it's operationalized here in Maryland makes sense to me. That teachers are members of the union, that there's a close relationship between the school and the district. I think that makes sense to me. And I think that this could actually be a model for the way that districts work across the country. Here, again, there's a lack of a strategy around education, both at the district level and citywide. And we can continue to refine the way that we fund public schools, whether they're traditional public schools or charter schools.
And so there is this debate happening in Maryland. Do you think any changes should be made to the model that right now it really constrains the national chains, which aren't coming in here, incoming in Maryland?
Yeah, I think that if there's any change, we need to figure out the funding formula for everybody is not what it should be, and there's public consensus around that. Again, I think that the way that charter schools are functioning now makes sense to me. I think that with everybody being a member of the union makes sense with the close relationship. The tension that is here now is about funding. It is not necessarily about the philosophical approach to schooling.
And talk more about the role of unions, because you were a former chapter leader in New York City with the UFT. Why do you think that's important today? There are a lot of groups that aren't, they don't favor teachers' unions, and a lot of parents, especially in some black communities, that say, they're just protecting bad teachers. How do you respond to that?
Teachers are the lifeblood of the institution of schools, and that's really important that we honor that. And as a chapter leader and as a union member, it was important that we got together and said, here's what we think schools should be for us as adults. And using that lens to fight for kids in any way that we could. I think that matters, especially with large groups of employees, to make sure that people aren't taken advantage of. And I've seen that work in New York, I've seen that work in Baltimore, I've seen that work in Minneapolis as being important. It is important, though, that we continue to push unions to think really thoughtfully about innovation. So how do we measure student success? How do we measure teacher effectiveness? How do we talk about those things that are really tough and make sure the union is leading and pushing districts to do that work?
So that is another kind of hot button topic. I'm a former educator myself worked in New York for a few years, and the issue of accountability and how to measure that and whether that's hurting education, that is actually a super important issue for educators. So some, like I mentioned, some parents feel that you're just protecting bad teachers without accountability, but some teachers and parents feel that by emphasizing testing, you're taking away from education. And I kind of had that experience being an educator. I was a history educator in New York, and I would go to fourth grade, 8th grade, 12th grade. I taught remedial classes in college, and kids didn't know the basics of the American Revolution. And I asked them why. I talked to their teachers, and they would say, well, they're focusing on math and English scores. So how do you respond to that debate? How do you kind of fit into that?
Yeah, so the framing will be that City Hall doesn't manage North Avenue. So my thoughts are thoughts that I believe are important, but again, don't manage the school system. I think that, there's also broad consensus that there are multiple measures for student effectiveness. That there's no one thing that is more necessarily the most important. So test scores are part of it. There's strong portfolio models across the country. With teachers, we've seen teacher observations be important for pushing people to grow, acknowledging the growth that has happened. So where I stand is about multiple measures, making sure that we aren't saying that standardized tests are the only way that we measure effectiveness, but that they can play a role.
And so the portfolio schools I know in New York, which you're familiar with, were actually a huge success. They're kind of a hidden secret. They didn't like to talk about it because they didn't want scrutiny from the state, but the portfolio schools would take kids that dropped out and take them off the standardized tests and give them feedback, give them more of a comprehensive approach to education. And instead of giving test scores, they'd have to present their final papers to a panel of experts. which
Yeah.
is a radical idea in public education.
And the
but
question is, how do we
demonstrate your
scale?
knowledge.
How do we scale that?
Right,
Right.
right.
So, like, we've seen these pockets of innovation be really powerful for kids. There are some kids who testing is the way that they perform really well in that space, right? And there's some kids that do really well in the portfolio space. With the portfolio, it's a question of how do we scale that? And we've seen that innovation be powerful in schools across the country.
So wouldn't that mean radically changing the funding formula, right? Like get the kind of funding that private schools have or other schools have.
Yeah, that's necessary. We know with the way that TIFs impact the funding formula here in the city, with the offsets for wealth, that we have to change the way that schools are funded if we're going to get to equity. And again, there's broad consensus about that as well.
And I want to stay on the issue of charter schools for a few moments at least, because I think it is important for people to know, your views and beliefs. So national chains like Success Academy, they haven't come to Maryland. I know you just said that you want to keep the system the same, but would you work with the chains to kind of work a compromise that would allow them to come and give them innovation, give them freedom, or would you reject those kind of proposals?
So it'd be the school system working with them, which
Yeah,
the mayor doesn't
right,
manage.
of course, right.
But KIPP is here.
Yeah.
KIPP is one of the largest charter school chains in the country, and they have a school here, or they have two schools now. I guess they're split up, and they operate within these constraints and are able to work within them to do the work of making sure every kid has a great teacher and a great education every day.
And so another issue kind of related to that is the role of wealthy philanthropists, what role they can play. And a lot of people would say, like, yeah, I think everyone would say, yeah, wealthy people, you've made your money off working class people, give something back, right? That's kind of an easy thing that everyone can agree on. But I guess critics might point to examples like what happened in Newark with Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million donation. And he was on Oprah kind of celebrating this, and you had the mayor of New York, Cory Booker, and the governor all celebrating it, which is a great idea. Like, public schools deserve tons of money. They deserve a chance to succeed as well as any school does. But that resulted in a lot of chaos, a lot of school closings, the opening of charter schools and the closing of public schools, and a huge fight over what the future of public education would look like in Newark. I know in your proposal you talk about the role, a little bit about what role philanthropy can play in it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so the context of Baltimore is so different than some of the cities that you named. In all big cities in America, there's a strong philanthropic community, and Baltimore is one of those cities for sure. Again, like I said, it's not here been a question of are there resources, are there great ideas.
Yeah.
It's wholly been a question of is there strategy. And I think there's a way for us to bring the philanthropic partners to the table and say, here are the things that we commit to doing in the next 4 or 5 years, and here's how we're going to align the resources to make sure that we get the impact that we think is important. And I think people have a role to play. I think what we've seen happen in the city is that without a mayor saying here are the priorities and sort of leading the charge, you see people making up the priorities as they go with the impact being minimal or not being something that we can see as a pocket of innovation and then scale up to have an impact that changes as many people's lives as possible.
And so this is an issue, the issue of kind of transparency that is universal among people's concerns in city government and in public schools. We just talked about TIFs. The city of Baltimore is losing tens of millions of dollars over the tax breaks given to wealthy developers downtown, right? And so you've called for some reform of that process, but so some would say we need to change the whole process because so it's almost too late. We need to open it up sooner to give the public more input in how it's decided who gets tax breaks, where that money is going. One of the slogans in some of the local protests recently has been send the money uptown, not downtown, right? Because that's where all the developments had been, and the working class people, the poor people, live uptown. They live in Sandtown. They don't live downtown. They're not getting these benefits. How do you make it more transparent? How do you get more people at the table to have a real voice in how that money is allocated and how it's spent?
So 3 things. One is that TIFs aren't wholly bad. That we've seen them be powerful in terms of bringing development and being coupled with things like community benefits agreements, where there's a clear plan informed by communities about how money is going to be distributed as a result of the development project. So we've seen that be powerful. The second is that we can use, what I'm proposing is a set of questions that we ask as we go through the TIF process. Like, are there clawback provisions? What's this going to do to the neighboring community? What does equity look like there? And the third is thinking about development beyond downtown, beyond the harbor, right? There are anchor institutions all across the city that we can use as hotbeds of development. And we know that we're about to transform all of the schools in the next 10 years in the city, and we can use that development that's going to come to neighborhoods to bundle some other development projects. And I think that there's a role for us to be strategic there.
And so another issue that goes, so the whole point of giving TIFs is to create jobs. And we want, I think everyone would agree that we need jobs with a living wage, right? Poverty wages are not really helping anybody. You've called for a statewide $15 minimum wage. That's going to take a huge fight. O'Malley can only pass a 10-10 minimum wage by 2018 when he was the governor here. Are there measures you would take on a city level if you were elected to get a more living wage, a $15 wage in Baltimore?
I think this is a fight that's worth fighting at the state level, because what we know is that people live and work in the city who are in all parts of the state. So people come in, people come out, and we should make sure that we don't incentivize people leaving the city to open businesses, which is what I worry about if we do something at the city level. So if we raise the minimum wage just here, then you could ostensibly move to Catonsville, open up a business, and you would be out of our range, and that's not helpful for people. And I'm mindful that the living wage is only for contractors and service contractors at that, right? So I think the way that would actually have the most impact and would change people's lives would be the state minimum wage. I think that city employees is a way to start. That's 14,000 people, and not all, and many of them already make $15 an hour. That doesn't do nearly enough to address the dire straits that so many people are in who are earning the minimum wage right now.
And so the problem you might run across to is that there's the biggest institutions in this city and state. For example, Johns Hopkins University, a couple years ago, the workers went on strike because 10-year veterans couldn't even get $12 an hour. And so these are powerful institutions. Hopkins is the biggest employer in the state. How are you going to get them on the table with this, with all the resources? And you talked about in your platform working with these large institutions, but how are you going to get them to see the light when they have, literally their workers went on strike for days. Their hospital was understaffed over raising the wage.
I think that we can help people understand that it is beneficial for all of the businesses and the city itself that people have more money to spend in the local economy, that actually matters, it has demonstrable impact, that this is as much about people's day-to-day lives as it is about the way that they will transform the economy by having more cash flow. And again, this is a part of what it means to have a strategy and a plan to bring all the partners together. I think what we haven't seen is City Hall lead in these efforts. And I think Johns Hopkins will be willing to sit at the table. I think the other large employers, I think it might not be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And it might not be immediate, but I think that we can do it.
And so the issue of drug addiction, the issue of the war on drugs is something that's prominent in your platform. I know it's something that's affected you personally. It's affected many people in Baltimore. So you mentioned ending the war on drugs. Marijuana is pretty much decriminalized now in the state. They just moved a measure to decriminalize paraphernalia, which is how they were getting people in the city. There's a proposal in Annapolis now to decriminalize things like cocaine and heroin, which people say would help reduce incarceration, which is obviously another thing you address, and it's a huge problem. Would you support those sort of steps in the city?
I'm more interested in the new research around injection sites that the mayor of Ithaca is pushing right now. The research has come out to be more favorable than any of us thought it would be. That the injection sites actually might be a pathway to treatment, which is so counterintuitive. But this idea that if people go to injection sites, that there's a touch that's happening, that we know who they are, that there's a rhythm, and that can actually
like
push
a safe injection site.
It's a
model that was like kind of pioneered in Vancouver.
In Vancouver, yep. Yeah. And they are talking about doing it in Ithaca.
It saved thousands of lives in the last 15 years. And but it's a radical idea. How are you going to sell the conservatives? And
it pushed people to treatment, which is so, I think people's fears about injection sites are the fears about methadone clinics, right? That methadone, for so many people, has actually not been a positive experience. It's not weaned them off of drugs. crack and cocaine are things that it's harder to deal with in those ways. I think that we've not seen as much innovative work in public health in terms of how to deal with addiction. What we know to be true is that inpatient treatment is really important, 30-day inpatient, increasing access to those. There's so many outpatient treatment centers in the city, but we know there's a dire need for more inpatient, and I support that.
And so you're a person that's connected with public schools, you're connected with protests. Win or lose, what kind of transformation do you want to see in Baltimore, where we've seen thousands of people on the streets demanding real change? How is that going to happen?
So when I think about protest to politics, I push on this notion that they are separate, right? I think that protest is one of the most political acts that people can engage in. I think that running for mayor is about traditional political roles, sort of pushing from the inside. I think that protest is about pushing from the outside. I think that what we all can do is continue to challenge the government to show up for people and to make people's lives better. I think that's what the platform does. I hope that is what I can do as a candidate and what I'll be able to do as mayor.
And for the people that aren't going to vote for you, if you win, what's your message to them? What can you promise them as mayor?
Yeah, so this is about making the city work for people across a host of things. So education, safety, and economics are the things that people think about the most. We also have to think about stormwater runoff, and it's destroying the bay. We have to think about the radical loss of green tops, and we have to think about adult illiteracy. So trying to make sure that we have a strategy to cover every part of people's lives is what my goal is and what my commitment will be.
DeRay McKesson, thanks so much for joining us.
Cool. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.